Jake Wheeler dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering across the kitchen floor as his 5-year-old son's words echoed through their new Texas home. Mason stood in his dinosaur pajamas, tears streaming down his face, pointing toward the basement with trembling fingers. "There's a big cow crying in the wall, Daddy, and he's been there so long." Sarah Wheeler's face went white, her teaching instincts recognizing something beyond childhood imagination in Mason's desperate voice. The boy had been drawing the same image for 3 weeks. A massive black and red bull with ancient, sorrowful eyes trapped behind concrete walls. Mrs. Coleman, their elderly neighbor, gasped from the doorway where she'd come to borrow sugar. "Sweet Jesus, that sounds like Bobby Hutchinson's thunder." Her weathered hands clutched her chest. "But Bobby disappeared 18 months ago, and Thunder would be dead," Jake whispered, staring at his son's latest drawing spread across the breakfast table, detailed sketches no 5-year-old should be able to create. Mason shook his head fiercely. "He's not dead, Daddy. He's just really hungry." How could an 800-pound Brahman bull survive cemented inside a basement wall? And why could only a child hear his cries? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 weeks earlier, the Wheeler family had pulled into the gravel driveway of their new home in Fredericksburg, Texas, with high hopes and heavy hearts. Jake Wheeler, 42 and recently retired from his agricultural engineering career, carried the weight of starting over after Sarah lost her teaching position in Houston. Their son Mason, 5 years old with an old soul's wisdom in his bright blue eyes, had been unusually quiet during the move, clutching his worn dinosaur blanket and sketching constantly in his notebook. Sarah Wheeler, 39 and still grieving 3 miscarriages that had left her maternal instincts raw and desperate, saw the 1950s ranch house as a fresh start. The wide front porch and sprawling oak trees reminded her of her grandmother's place, where she'd spent summers learning that children and animals always knew things adults missed. Her auburn hair caught the Texas sun as she watched Mason explore their new yard, his small hands trailing along fence posts with peculiar intensity. The previous owner's story emerged slowly through whispered conversations with neighbors. Robert Bobby Hutchinson had been a local rancher, well respected until tragedy struck like lightning across clear sky. His wife Margaret had died of cancer during the 2019 agricultural crisis, when medical bills and failed crops destroyed their 40-year marriage's foundation. Their 16-year-old daughter Emma, Bobby's pride and joy, had been killed 6 months later in a car accident while driving to her part-time job at the local veterinary clinic. Mrs. Betty Coleman, 75 and sharp as a tack despite her arthritic hands, lived 2 houses down in a cottage surrounded by prize-winning roses. She'd lost her own ranch in 2008, watching helplessly as medical bills from her husband's long illness forced them to sell everything they'd built together. Now she survived on Social Security and memories, her weathered face holding stories of better times when neighbors knew each other's business and helped without being asked. "Bobby just disappeared," Mrs. Coleman explained over sweet tea on that first afternoon, her voice carrying the particular sadness of rural Texas, where pride ran deeper than wells and asking for help felt like admitting defeat. Police found his truck by Lake Travis, figured he'd walked into the water like so many others been doing lately. This agricultural crisis is breaking hearts and minds faster than we can count. Dr. Amanda Foster, the local large animal veterinarian, had treated Bobby's cattle for 15 years before everything fell apart. At 52, she carried her own grief. Her husband had died in a ranching accident 5 years prior, and she channeled her maternal energy into healing animals that couldn't speak their pain. She remembered Bobby's particular devotion to a Brahman calf named Thunder, Emma's favorite, with distinctive black and red coloring that made him stand out among the herd. Detective Mike Harrison, 48, and tired of investigating agricultural suicides that seemed to multiply like wildflowers after rain, had closed Bobby's case when no body surfaced after 3 months of searching. In rural Texas, men walked into lakes when the weight of loss became heavier than their boots could carry. The first night in their new home, Mason Wheeler sat bolt upright in his twin bed at exactly 2:17 a.m., his dinosaur blanket clutched against his chest. The digital clock's red glow illuminated his wide eyes as he strained to hear the sound that had pulled him from sleep, a low, mournful cry that seemed to seep through the floorboards like groundwater finding its way to light. "Mama," he whispered, padding barefoot down the hallway to his parents' room. "There's someone crying downstairs." Jake groaned, checking his phone. "Buddy, it's the middle of the night. Old houses make weird noises. Go back to bed." But Mason shook his head with the stubborn certainty that only 5-year-olds possess. "It's not the house, Daddy. It's a big animal, and he's really sad." Sarah, her maternal instincts still raw from years of loss, followed her son downstairs with a flashlight. They stood in the basement together, listening to nothing but the hum of the old furnace and the settling of 60-year-old wooden beams. Yet Mason remained convinced, pointing toward the east wall with unwavering determination. "He's right there, Mama. Behind the wall. His name is Thunder." The next morning brought more questions than answers. Mason appeared at breakfast with his sketchbook, having drawn a remarkably detailed picture of a massive bull with distinctive coloring, deep black with reddish-brown patches across his face and shoulders. The proportions were too accurate for a child's imagination, the eyes too soulful for random creativity. "Where did you see this cow, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently, her teacher's training helping her recognize when a child was processing something real rather than fantastical. "In my dreams," Mason replied matter-of-factly. "But he's not sleeping. He's awake in the dark place, and he's been there so long he forgot what sunshine feels like." Jake remained skeptical, chalking it up to the stress of moving and perhaps too many animal documentaries. But as days passed, Mason's obsession intensified. He would sit by the basement wall for hours, having one-sided conversations with his invisible friend, bringing down bowls of water and crackers that sat untouched on the concrete floor. "Thunder's thirsty, but he can't reach the water," Mason explained when his mother found the offerings. "The walls are too thick, but he knows I'm trying to help." By the end of the first week, Mason's kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, called with concerns. The boy had spent art time creating increasingly disturbing images, the same bull trapped behind concrete blocks, sometimes with tears drawn as actual blue crayon drops falling from enormous brown eyes. "Has Mason experienced any trauma recently, Mrs.?" Rodriguez asked during the awkward phone call. "These drawings are quite intense for a child his age. There's an emotional depth here that suggests he's processing something significant." Sarah found herself defending her son's sanity while secretly questioning her own. "We just moved from Houston. Maybe he's having adjustment difficulties." But Mason's behavior suggested otherwise. Rather than acting out or withdrawing, he seemed driven by purpose, as if he'd been assigned a mission that only he could complete. He ate less, slept fitfully, and spent every free moment trying to communicate with whatever existed behind that basement wall. Mrs. Coleman's visit on Friday afternoon changed everything. The elderly neighbor had come to borrow sugar and found Mason in the yard, drawing his latest masterpiece. Thunder standing in a green pasture with a teenage girl brushing his coat. "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Coleman breathed, her weathered hands trembling as she studied the sketch. "That's Emma Hutchinson and Bobby's prize calf. But how could this child possibly—" She trailed off, sinking into a porch chair as if the weight of recognition had stolen her strength. Thunder was Emma's favorite, she continued, her voice carrying the particular grief of rural communities where everyone knows everyone's stories. That bull followed her around like a faithful dog. After Emma died in that car accident, Bobby wasn't right in the head anymore. Mason looked up from his drawing with those unsettling blue eyes that seemed too old for his face. Thunder remembers the girl with braids. She used to sing to him, and her hands smelled like apple shampoo. He misses her so much it makes his chest hurt. Mrs. Coleman gasped, pressing her hand to her heart. Emma did have braids, and she always used that fancy shampoo her mama bought special from Austin. Sweet child loved that bull more than anything. That evening, as Mason sat by the basement wall having his nightly conversation with Thunder, his parents stood at the top of the stairs listening to their son's half of what sounded increasingly like a real dialogue. "I know you're scared, Thunder, but I'm going to help you, okay? My daddy's really smart and my mama has a big heart. They just need to understand that you're real." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes as she watched her son's compassionate determination. Jake remained skeptical but couldn't deny the consistency of Mason's story or the emotional authenticity of his drawings. "Tomorrow," Jake decided aloud, "I'm getting my stud finder and checking that wall." Saturday morning brought Jake Wheeler to his basement with the electronic stud finder in one hand and his son's unwavering faith pressing against his skeptical mind. The device beeped erratically as he ran it across the east wall, revealing structural inconsistencies that shouldn't exist in a properly built foundation. Where standard 16-inch spacing should have registered, the tool detected a hollow cavity nearly 8 feet wide. "That's impossible," Jake muttered, running the device over the same area 3 times with identical results. The wall showed clear evidence of recent construction. Different mortar color, slightly misaligned blocks, and most telling of all, a small ventilation grate near the floor that led nowhere according to the house's original blueprints. Mason sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, nodding with the satisfaction of someone finally being proven right. "Thunder says thank you for listening, Daddy. He knew you were a good man because I told him so." Sarah joined them in the basement carrying a cup of coffee and the phone number for Detective Harrison that Mrs. Coleman had provided. "Betty told me more about Bobby Hutchinson last night," she said quietly, conscious that Mason was listening. The man wasn't just grieving, he was having what she called episodes after Emma died. The pieces of Bobby Hutchinson's tragic story emerged like fragments of pottery unearthed from hard soil. Mrs. Coleman had witnessed his decline firsthand, watching a respected rancher transform into a paranoid recluse who saw threats everywhere. His wife, Margaret's death from cancer had been devastating enough. But losing 16-year-old Emma 6 months later in a senseless car accident had shattered something fundamental in Bobby's mind. He started talking about protecting what was left, Mrs. Coleman had explained over the phone, her voice heavy with regret. "Said the world was too dangerous, too cruel for innocent things. I thought he meant he was going to sell his cattle and move away. Never imagined he might." Detective Harrison arrived within an hour of Jake's call, his weathered face showing the strain of investigating too many rural tragedies. At 48, he'd seen the agricultural crisis destroy families with mechanical precision. First the finances, then the hope. Finally the sanity of good people pushed beyond their breaking point. "Bobby Hutchinson," Harrison said, consulting his notes while Jake showed him the wall anomalies. "Missing person case from 18 months ago. We found his truck by Lake Travis with a suicide note that was more like rambling about failure and loss. Never found a body, but in these cases..." He shrugged with the resignation of someone who'd seen this story too many times. But Mason's drawings gave Harrison pause. The boy had captured details about Thunder that no child could have invented: the distinctive heart-shaped white patch on the bull's forehead, the slight bend in his left horn from a childhood injury, even the way his ears drooped when he was sad. These were specifics that only someone who'd known the animal intimately would remember. "Son," Harrison said, kneeling to Mason's eye level with the practiced gentleness of a grandfather, "can you tell me more about Thunder? What else has he shared with you?" Mason considered the question with unusual seriousness. He remembers when the sad man brought him food and water every day, but then the man started crying all the time and talking to Emma even though she wasn't there anymore. Thunder says the man was scared of something outside, something that wanted to hurt Thunder, so he built the safe place. Harrison exchanged meaningful glances with Jake and Sarah. Bobby's mental state in those final weeks had been documented through neighbor reports, erratic behavior, paranoid delusions about threats to his remaining livestock, and an obsession with protecting Thunder from imaginary dangers. "The man thought he was saving Thunder from something bad," Mason continued, his 5-year-old vocabulary struggling to convey concepts beyond his years. "But then the man went away and never came back, and Thunder's been waiting and waiting." That afternoon, Harrison obtained a warrant to search Bobby Hutchinson's abandoned property 3 miles outside town. What they discovered there painted a disturbing picture of a mind unraveling under unbearable grief. Bobby's house contained journals documenting his descent into paranoid delusions, detailed plans for protective containment of his livestock, and dozens of photographs of Thunder as a calf playing with Emma. The final journal entry, dated exactly 18 months prior, was barely legible. "They're coming for him tomorrow. The slaughter truck. Can't let them take Emma's baby. Built the safe room behind the Morrison place like the bunker plans. Thunder will be protected there until the danger passes. We'll bring him food every day, just until it's safe again." But Bobby had never returned from his trip to Lake Travis, leaving Thunder trapped in his protective prison with only rainwater seeping through a deliberate crack in the foundation and whatever small creatures might venture through the inadequate ventilation system. Dr. Amanda Foster arrived at the Wheeler house that evening, her veterinary bag and large animal expertise requested by Detective Harrison. The 52-year-old widow had been treating cattle for 25 years and knew the reality of what they might find behind that wall. "If there really is a bull back there," she said with professional honesty, "after 18 months, we need to prepare for the worst. Brahman cattle are remarkably hardy, but no animal could survive that long without proper nutrition and care." Mason, overhearing the adult conversation, approached Dr. Foster with the directness that only children possess. "Thunder's not dead," he said firmly. "He's just really, really tired and sad, but he's been waiting for someone to find him, and now we have." As the sun set over the Texas Hill Country, the Wheeler family faced an impossible decision. The evidence pointed toward a tragic discovery that would likely traumatize their young son while potentially uncovering the remains of Bobby Hutchinson's final desperate act of love gone terribly wrong. Yet Mason's certainty never wavered, and something in his unwavering faith began to convince even the most skeptical adults that miracles, however improbable, still occasionally occurred in a world that had grown too familiar with heartbreak. Sunday morning arrived with the weight of decision pressing down on the Wheeler household like storm clouds gathering over the hill country. Jake stood in his kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hands, while Sarah paced the length of their living room with the restless energy of a mother whose instincts were at war with logic. Mason sat at the breakfast table, methodically eating his cereal while humming a tune he claimed Thunder had taught him, a melody none of them recognized but somehow felt familiar. "We could be opening Pandora's box," Jake said for the 3rd time in an hour. "If there really is something behind that wall, and it's what we think it is, Mason's going to see things no 5-year-old should witness." Sarah paused her pacing, her auburn hair catching the morning light streaming through their kitchen window. And if we don't look, and Mason's right, then we're leaving a living creature to suffer because we're too afraid of what we might find. Her voice carried the particular authority of a mother who had lost too much already and refused to lose anything else to inaction. Mrs. Coleman arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, carrying a casserole dish and the determined expression of someone who had made peace with difficult truths. "In my 75 years," she announced, settling the green bean casserole on their counter, "I've learned that children and animals don't lie about pain. If that boy says there's suffering behind your wall, then there's suffering that needs addressing." By 9 a.m., their kitchen had become an unofficial command center. Detective Harrison spread Bobby Hutchinson's recovered journals across the table while Dr. Foster reviewed large animal emergency protocols on her tablet. The evidence painted an increasingly clear picture of a man whose grief had twisted love into something unrecognizable. Bobby's journals revealed the progression of his mental deterioration with heartbreaking clarity. Early entries after Emma's death showed normal grieving, sadness, anger, despair, but gradually transformed into paranoid fantasies about threats to Thunder. He had become convinced that cattle thieves, government agents, and even well-meaning neighbors posed existential dangers to Emma's beloved bull. "Listen to this entry from 6 months before he disappeared," Harrison read aloud. "They came by again today, asking about buying Thunder. Told them he's not for sale. Never will be. Emma made me promise to take care of him forever. But they keep coming back. Mrs. Coleman pretends to be friendly, but I see how she looks at him. They all want to take him away from me. Take away the last piece of Emma I have left." Mrs. Coleman's weathered hands shook as she absorbed Bobby's distorted perception of her innocent visits. "I was just being neighborly," she whispered. "Bringing him casseroles, checking if he needed anything from town. I never wanted Thunder. I just wanted to help." The most disturbing entries detailed Bobby's construction of what he called Emma's safe room, a reinforced concrete enclosure built into the basement foundation of the abandoned house he'd purchased under a false name. The plans were elaborate, including ventilation systems, drainage for waste, and even a feeding mechanism that could be operated from outside the containment area. "He spent months planning this," Dr. Foster observed, her professional demeanor unable to hide her horror. "This wasn't a spontaneous act of madness. This was systematic, methodical delusion executed with engineering precision." The final entries became increasingly erratic, filled with claims that they were closing in, that Thunder would be safer in the protective bunker until the danger passed. Bobby had convinced himself that temporary containment was an act of love, a father protecting his daughter's memory by preserving the animal that had brought her joy. Jake found himself studying his own son, trying to understand how a 5-year-old could possibly know details that existed only in a dead man's diseased imagination. Mason continued coloring, occasionally pausing to hold conversations with empty air, his side of the dialogue revealing information that no child should possess. "Thunder remembers the day the walls closed," Mason said without looking up from his crayons. "The sad man was crying and telling him it was just for a little while, just until the bad people went away. Thunder wasn't scared at first because he trusted the man, but then it got dark, and the man never came back." Dr. Foster knelt beside Mason's chair, her medical training helping her approach the boy with appropriate gentleness. "Mason, honey, when Thunder talks to you, what exactly do you hear?" The 5-year-old considered her question with unusual solemnity. "I don't hear words like when you talk to me. It's more like pictures and feelings, like when you're really sad, and you can't explain why, but the sadness fills up your whole body. Thunder's sadness is so big it goes through the walls." Sarah felt her maternal heart breaking, as she watched her son describe empathy in terms no kindergartner should need to understand. The weight of Thunder's suffering had somehow found its way into her child's consciousness, creating a burden that Mason carried with the stoic acceptance of someone much older. The debate over whether to proceed consumed most of Sunday afternoon. Detective Harrison worried about legal implications, destruction of property, potential contamination of evidence, the trauma of discovering decomposed remains in front of a child. Dr. Foster expressed medical concerns about infectious diseases, toxic gases, and the psychological impact on Mason if his faith proved misplaced. But Mrs. Coleman, drawing on 7 decades of rural wisdom, cut through their deliberations with characteristic directness. "Y'all are overthinking this," she announced from her perch on their couch. "That boy hasn't been wrong about a single detail yet. If he says Thunder's alive, then we owe it to both of them to find out." The turning point came when Mason approached the group of adults with a drawing he'd completed that afternoon. The image showed Thunder lying on his side in darkness, his massive frame reduced to skin and bones, but his eyes still bright with the spark of life. In the corner of the paper, Mason had drawn a small figure, himself, reaching through bars toward the suffering animal. "Thunder wants me to tell you something important," Mason said, his 5-year-old voice carrying unusual gravity. "He says Emma visits him sometimes in his dreams, and she told him that help was coming. She said her daddy was sick in his heart, and he wasn't thinking right when he built the dark place. But Emma forgives him because love sometimes gets confused when people hurt too much." The adults fell silent, absorbing the profound wisdom emerging from a child's innocent interpretation of complex adult emotions. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, recognizing in her son's words the kind of forgiveness that only pure hearts can offer. Jake made the decision that evening over a dinner none of them ate with much appetite. "We break through the wall tomorrow morning," he announced, his engineer's mind already calculating the safest approach. "But we do it right, Doctor." Foster standing by with emergency equipment, Detective Harrison documenting everything, and Mason stays upstairs until we know what we're dealing with. Mason looked up from his untouched plate, his blue eyes holding depths that seemed inappropriate for someone who still needed help tying his shoes. "Thunder says thank you, Daddy. He says he's been practicing staying strong because he knew this day would come." That night, as the Wheeler family prepared for what could be either a miraculous rescue or a heartbreaking discovery, word spread through Fredericksburg's tight-knit community. Mrs. Coleman had shared the story with her church ladies, who had shared it with their families, who had posted it on social media with the viral enthusiasm of people hungry for hope in difficult times. By Monday morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the Wheeler house, neighbors bringing coffee and moral support, local reporters drawn by the human interest angle, and even a few skeptics hoping to witness the debunking of what they considered elaborate fantasy. Dr. Foster arrived before dawn with emergency medical equipment designed for large animals: IV fluids, antibiotics, pain medication, and portable monitoring devices. Her truck also carried something more sobering: a humane euthanasia kit in case Thunder's condition proved beyond salvation. Detective Harrison brought official documentation and a photographer, preparing for whatever truth lay behind the basement wall. But he also brought something unexpected: a letter that had arrived at the police station over the weekend, postmarked from a psychiatric facility in Austin. "It's from Bobby Hutchinson," Harrison announced to the assembled group. He's been a patient at a mental health facility for the past year, recovering from a complete psychotic break. He remembers building the containment area, but his memory of what happened afterward is fragmentary. He's been trying to remember where he put Thunder. The revelation added another layer of complexity to their mission. Bobby Hutchinson was alive, receiving treatment for the mental illness that had driven him to desperate measures, but his memory of Thunder's location had been lost in the fog of psychological trauma. As Jake prepared his tools for breaching the wall, Mason sat quietly in the basement, one small hand pressed against the concrete barrier that had contained so much suffering for so long. His lips moved in what appeared to be silent prayer, but anyone listening closely would have heard him whispering reassurances to a friend who had waited 18 months for rescue. "It's time, Thunder," Mason said softly. "Emma was right. Help is here." Monday morning arrived with the weight of 18 months of suffering about to be revealed. Jake Wheeler stood before the basement wall with a sledgehammer in his trembling hands, while Dr. Foster positioned her emergency medical equipment and Detective Harrison prepared his camera to document whatever truth lay behind the concrete blocks. The small crowd that had gathered outside could be heard through the basement windows, neighbors offering prayers, reporters adjusting their microphones, and somewhere in the mix, Mrs. Coleman's voice leading a group in singing "Amazing Grace." Mason had been banished to the living room under Sarah's watchful eye, but his protests echoed down the basement stairs. "Thunder's scared about all the noise," he called down. "He wants me to be there when you find him, so he knows everything's going to be okay." Jake raised the sledgehammer, then hesitated. What if 18 months of his son's unwavering faith was about to be shattered by the reality of decomposed remains? What if Thunder was nothing more than bones and the desperate imagination of a grieving child who needed to believe in something good? "Do it," Dr. Foster said quietly, her veterinary bag open and ready. "Whatever we find, that animal has waited long enough." The first blow sent concrete dust cascading across the basement floor. The second opened a hairline crack that released a smell, not the sweet decay of death, but the sour staleness of confinement, unwashed living conditions, and something else that made Dr. Foster's eyes widen with recognition. "That's not decomposition," she whispered. That's the smell of a living animal in distress." Jake swung again, the crack widening enough to reveal darkness beyond. He grabbed his flashlight and peered through the opening, his breath catching in his throat as the beam illuminated what lay within Bobby Hutchinson's safe room. A massive brown eye stared back at him from the darkness, sunken, surrounded by protruding bones but undeniably alive and aware. Thunder, reduced from his original 800 pounds to perhaps half that weight, lay on his side in a concrete cell barely large enough to contain his enormous frame. His black and red coat had grown long and matted, his ribs visible through skin that had lost all subcutaneous fat. But his breathing was steady, and his gaze held the intelligence that had sustained him through 18 months of unimaginable solitude. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed, his voice breaking. "Sarah, call Mason down here. Now!" Dr. Foster was already pushing past him, her professional training overriding the emotional shock. "He's alive, but barely. Severe malnutrition, probably dehydration, muscle atrophy from confinement. We need to get him out of there immediately." The opening was too small for Thunder's extraction, so Jake continued demolishing the wall while Dr. Foster assessed the bull's condition through the gap. Thunder's massive head lifted slightly at the sound of human voices, and something remarkable happened. His tail, though weakened, thumped once against the concrete floor in what could only be described as gratitude. Mason appeared on the basement stairs before Sarah could stop him, his 5-year-old frame moving with purpose toward the wall where his 18-month conversation partner was finally being revealed. "Thunder," he called softly, and the effect on the imprisoned bull was immediate and undeniable. Thunder's head turned toward Mason's voice, his eyes focusing with an intensity that defied his physical condition. He attempted to lift himself, failing due to weakness but managing to shift his position so he could see the child who had been his lifeline to sanity. "I told you I'd find you," Mason said, tears streaming down his face as he pressed his small hand against the remaining concrete between them. "I told you help was coming." Dr. Foster watched in amazement as Thunder responded to Mason's presence with energy that seemed impossible given his condition. The bull's breathing became more regular, his eyes more alert, as if the child's proximity was providing strength that medical science couldn't explain. "This is unprecedented," she murmured to Detective Harrison, who was documenting the scene with his camera. "Animals in extreme stress typically withdraw, become unresponsive. I've never seen a creature in this condition react so positively to human contact." The wall demolition took 2 hours, with Jake carefully removing each block to avoid injuring Thunder while enlarging the opening enough for extraction. As the barrier came down, the full horror of Bobby Hutchinson's twisted salvation became apparent. The safe room was a concrete tomb 8 feet long, 5 feet wide, and 6 feet high, barely adequate for a calf, but criminally inadequate for a full-grown bull. Thunder had survived on rainwater that seeped through a deliberate crack in the ceiling, supplemented by whatever small creatures had found their way through the inadequate ventilation system. His body had cannibalized its own muscle mass to sustain vital organs, leaving him a skeletal version of his former magnificent self, yet his spirit remained unbroken. As the final blocks were removed, Thunder lifted his head and made a sound, not quite a moo but a low rumble that conveyed 18 months of stored communication. Mason understood immediately. "He's saying thank you," the boy translated, his hand now able to touch Thunder's face directly. "And he's telling you that Emma visited him in dreams and said you were all good people who would help him get strong again." Dr. Foster began her emergency treatment immediately, establishing an IV line for rehydration while examining Thunder's pressure sores and assessing his ability to stand. "His vital signs are surprisingly stable," she reported. "Heart rate elevated but strong, breathing labored but adequate. This bull has an incredible will to live." The extraction process required careful coordination. Thunder was too weak to stand unassisted but too heavy to lift manually. Jake and Detective Harrison constructed a makeshift ramp while Dr. Foster continued fluid replacement therapy, her medical equipment creating a surreal contrast with the primitive concrete cell that had been Thunder's world. Mason remained at Thunder's head throughout the process, his small hands stroking the bull's face while maintaining a constant stream of reassurance. "Dr. Foster is going to make you better," he explained in the patient tone of someone speaking to a beloved friend. "And then you're going to live with us, and you'll have green grass and sunshine every day." Thunder's response was to nuzzle Mason's palm with his massive nose, a gesture of trust so profound that even the skeptical adults watching found themselves wiping away tears. The crowd outside had grown to nearly 50 people as word spread through social media. Local television crews arrived just as Thunder was being carefully guided up the ramp and out of his basement prison, his first glimpse of natural light in 18 months causing him to blink rapidly while his body trembled with what could only be described as relief. Mrs. Coleman stood on the Wheelers' front porch, her weathered hands clasped in prayer as she watched the miraculous rescue unfold. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered. "That boy was right all along. Sweet Jesus, that boy was right." Thunder's emergence into the Wheelers' backyard created a moment of collective silence among the gathered crowd. Here was proof that miracles still occurred in a world too familiar with tragedy, that love, however misguided, could sometimes transcend the boundaries of reason, and that the bond between human and animal could sustain life even in circumstances that defied all logic. Dr. Foster worked quickly to stabilize Thunder in the afternoon sunlight, his black and red coat revealing the full extent of his physical deterioration, while his eyes reflected a spiritual strength that had carried him through the darkest of times. Mason never left his side, his 5-year-old presence providing comfort that no medical intervention could match. "The next 48 hours will be critical," Dr. Foster announced to the assembled crowd and media. "Thunder has survived something that should have been impossible, but his recovery will require intensive care, proper nutrition, and time for his body to remember how to process normal amounts of food." As the sun set over the Texas hill country, Thunder lay in a makeshift recovery area in the Wheelers' garage, surrounded by monitoring equipment and the constant attention of both medical professionals and one determined little boy who had never stopped believing that love could conquer even the most impossible circumstances. The story had already begun spreading across social media with hashtags like #ThunderMiracle and #NeverGiveUp. But for the Wheeler family, the viral fame mattered less than the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had answered the call of suffering and found the strength to act when action seemed impossible. Thunder was alive, Mason had been vindicated, and somewhere in a mental health facility in Austin, Bobby Hutchinson would soon learn that his desperate act of protective love had not ended in the tragedy everyone had assumed. The miracle of Thunder's rescue lasted exactly 43 hours before the weight of reality came crashing down like a Texas thunderstorm. Dr. Foster's optimistic prognosis on Monday evening transformed into grave concern by Wednesday morning as Thunder's weakened organs began failing under the stress of recovery. His kidneys, damaged by 18 months of dehydration and malnutrition, could no longer process the fluids being pumped into his system. His liver, overworked from metabolizing his own muscle tissue for survival, began shutting down despite the best veterinary care available. "His body is going into shock," Dr. Foster explained to the Wheeler family in the hushed tones reserved for delivering devastating news. After surviving the impossible for so long, the sudden change in his condition, the food, the fluids, even the sunlight, its overwhelming systems that have been operating at bare minimum for over a year. Mason sat beside Thunder's makeshift hospital bed in the garage, his small hand resting on the bull's massive head as monitors beeped erratically around them. The 5-year-old seemed to age years in the span of hours, as he watched his friend struggle with each labored breath. "Thunder says he's tired," Mason whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "He says he wants to see Emma, but he doesn't want to leave me alone." The medical bills began mounting with terrifying speed. Emergency large animal care, specialized equipment rentals, round-the-clock monitoring, and experimental treatments pushed the costs beyond $15,000 in the first week alone. Jake's retirement savings, already strained from their move to Texas, dwindled rapidly as they threw everything they had into saving Thunder's life. "We can't keep this up," Jake told Sarah during a tense kitchen conversation while Mason slept fitfully upstairs. "The emergency fund is nearly gone, and Dr. Foster is talking about transferring him to the veterinary teaching hospital in College Station. That could cost another $50,000. Sarah's response carried the fierce determination of a mother whose child's heart was breaking. "Then we mortgage the house. We sell whatever we need to sell. That boy has believed in Thunder for months when nobody else would. We don't give up now." But Thunder's condition continued deteriorating despite every intervention. His temperature spiked dangerously high, his breathing became increasingly labored, and most heartbreaking of all, he stopped responding to Mason's voice with his usual alertness. The bull who had maintained hope through 18 months of imprisonment seemed to be losing his will to fight just when freedom had finally arrived. Mrs. Coleman, now 86 and struggling with her own health issues after the emotional stress of Thunder's discovery, suffered a mild heart attack on Thursday evening. As paramedics wheeled her into the same ambulance bay where Thunder had been treated days earlier, she grabbed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Don't let that bull die thinking he failed that boy," she wheezed through the oxygen mask. "Some stories are supposed to end with miracles, Sarah, but maybe the miracle isn't always what we expect it to be." The crisis deepened when Bobby Hutchinson's psychiatric facility called Friday morning. The 58-year-old former rancher had learned about Thunder's discovery through news coverage and was experiencing a severe psychological episode. His memories of the imprisonment were returning in fragmented pieces, bringing with them overwhelming guilt and renewed paranoid delusions. He's convinced that Thunder's suffering is divine punishment for his actions, the facility's social worker explained to Detective Harrison. Mr. Hutchinson is talking about discharge himself to face justice, but in his current mental state, that could be extremely dangerous. The media attention that had initially brought support and donations began turning predatory as Thunder's condition worsened. Reporters camped outside the Wheeler house, live streaming updates and interviewing neighbors about the boy who talked to animals and whether the family was exploiting their son's trauma for attention. Social media comments ranged from prayers and support to cruel speculation about parental manipulation and staged publicity stunts. Mason, sheltered from most of the outside chaos, remained focused entirely on Thunder's declining health. He refused to attend kindergarten, barely 8, and spent every waking moment beside the dying bull, carrying on conversations that only he could hear. His drawings during this period became increasingly dark. Thunder surrounded by shadowy figures, Mason reaching toward a light that seemed impossibly distant. "Thunder's confused," Mason told Dr. Foster during one of her evening visits. "He says the bright place keeps calling to him, but he made a promise to stay until I was ready to let him go. He doesn't understand why I'm not ready yet." Dr. Foster, her professional composure cracking after days of fighting a losing battle, knelt beside the 5-year-old. "Mason, honey, sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. Thunder has suffered enough. Maybe it's time to stop fighting and let him find peace." The suggestion sent Mason into inconsolable tears. "But he's my friend. He waited for me for so long, and I promised I'd take care of him." "If Thunder dies, then the bad man wins, and Emma will be sad, and everything will be broken forever." That night, as Thunder's breathing became increasingly shallow, the Wheeler family faced an impossible decision. Dr. Foster's professional recommendation was clear. Thunder's organs were failing, his pain was becoming unmanageable, and humane euthanasia would end his suffering with dignity. The alternative was watching him die slowly over the next few days, each breath a struggle that served no purpose except prolonging inevitable heartbreak. Jake sat in the garage at midnight, watching his son sleep curled against Thunder's side while the bull's labored breathing filled the silence. The man who had spent his career solving engineering problems with logic and mathematics found himself confronting a situation where love and hope collided brutally with medical reality. Sarah joined him in the vigil, bringing coffee and the weight of her own impossible choices. "He's going to hate us," she said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Mason's going to believe we gave up on Thunder, and I don't know how we live with that." "And if we let Thunder suffer just to avoid breaking Mason's heart?" Jake replied, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "What does that teach him about love, about making hard choices when someone you care about is in pain?" Thunder's condition took a final turn for the worse just before dawn. His temperature spiked to dangerous levels, his kidneys stopped producing urine entirely, And most telling of all, he stopped acknowledging Mason's presence. The bull, who had maintained consciousness and connection throughout his imprisonment, finally retreated into the biological shutdown that precedes death. Dr. Foster arrived at sunrise with her medical bag and the terrible kindness of someone who had ended suffering countless times. "He's in multi-organ failure," she announced after checking Thunder's vital signs. "His body is shutting down systematically. We can continue aggressive treatment, but that means prolonging his pain without realistic hope of recovery." Mason, awakened by the discussion, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment with the intuitive wisdom that had carried him through months of believing the impossible. He climbed onto Thunder's makeshift bed, pressing his face against the bull's massive neck while tears soaked into the matted fur. "Thunder says thank you for fighting so hard," Mason whispered, his 5-year-old voice carrying the weight of unbearable loss. "He says Emma's here now, and she's beautiful, and she's not hurt anymore, but he's scared about leaving me behind." The adults surrounding Thunder's deathbed, parents, veterinarian, detective, and neighbors who had gathered to witness the end of an impossible story, found themselves crying openly as a child prepared to say goodbye to a friend whose survival had defied every rational expectation. Thunder's eyes, which had maintained their spark through 18 months of darkness, began to dim as his massive heart struggled to pump blood through failing organs. His breathing became irregular, each exhale potentially his last, while Mason continued whispering reassurances about green pastures and sunshine and the promise that love never truly ends, even when bodies fail. The miracle that everyone had hoped for was not going to happen. Thunder, who had survived the impossible, was going to die just days after tasting freedom, leaving behind a grieving child and a community that had invested their faith in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Just as Dr. Foster prepared the syringe that would end Thunder's suffering, Mason suddenly sat up straight, his tear-stained face transformed by an expression of startling clarity. "Wait," he said, with the authority of someone receiving urgent instructions only he could hear. "Thunder says we need to go to the place where Emma is sleeping. He says there's something there that will help him remember how to get better." Dr. Foster paused, her medical training warring with the inexplicable hope that had sustained this impossible situation from the beginning. "Mason, sweetheart, Thunder is very sick. Moving him could—" "Emma's telling Thunder about a special medicine her daddy hid before he got confused," Mason interrupted, his 5-year-old vocabulary struggling with concepts beyond his years. "She says it's in the barn where she used to brush Thunder when he was little, buried under the place where they kept the ribbons from the fair." Detective Harrison exchanged meaningful glances with Jake Wheeler. Bobby Hutchinson's property had been searched multiple times, but they had focused on the house and immediate outbuildings. The old show barn, where Emma had trained Thunder for local livestock competitions, had been deemed too dilapidated for thorough investigation. "It's worth checking," Harrison said quietly. "If there's even a chance." Sarah Wheeler, her maternal instincts screaming against moving her son's dying friend, found herself nodding. "If Mason thinks there's hope, then we have to try. We've come this far on faith." The convoy that traveled to Bobby Hutchinson's abandoned ranch 15 minutes later would have seemed surreal to any outside observer. Thunder, barely conscious and supported by a portable oxygen system, rode in Dr. Foster's specially equipped trailer while Mason sat beside him, maintaining constant reassurance through whispered conversations. Jake and Sarah followed in their truck, hearts breaking, as they watched their son cling to hope that seemed increasingly desperate with each labored breath Thunder took. The ranch, abandoned for 18 months, showed the devastating effects of agricultural foreclosure. Weeds grew through cracked concrete, fence posts leaned at odd angles, and the main house's windows stared emptily across pastures where cattle had once grazed. But the old show barn still stood, its faded red paint and sagging roof holding memories of better times when Emma Hutchinson had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian and Thunder had been her prize-winning partner. "Over there," Mason said the moment they entered the barn, pointing toward a corner where tattered blue ribbons still hung from rusty nails. "Emma says to dig under the place where Thunder learned to stand still for the judges." Jake grabbed a shovel from the truck while Dr. Foster monitored Thunder's deteriorating vital signs in the trailer outside. Each swing of the shovel felt like a race against time, dirt flying as he followed his son's increasingly specific directions. 3 feet down, the shovel struck something metallic, a waterproof container buried with the desperate care of someone hiding treasure. Inside the container, wrapped in plastic and accompanied by a note in Bobby Hutchinson's increasingly erratic handwriting, were vials of veterinary antibiotics, emergency medications, and detailed instructions for treating cattle in crisis situations. The note, dated just weeks before Bobby's disappearance, revealed the tragic irony of his mental breakdown. "Emergency medical supplies for Thunder," the note read in Bobby's deteriorating script. "Hidden here in case the bad people come and I can't get to him right away. Emma always said this barn was the safest place on the ranch. If something happens to me, maybe someone who loves him will find this and know what to do." Dr. Foster's hands trembled as she examined the medications. Several were experimental treatments for livestock organ failure, drugs that weren't widely available but could potentially address Thunder's kidney and liver dysfunction. Others were antibiotics specifically designed for severely compromised immune systems, exactly what Thunder needed to fight the infections threatening his recovery. "This is incredible," she breathed, her professional amazement overriding the emotional chaos of the situation. "These medications, they're precisely what Thunder needs, and they're still viable." It's like Bobby prepared for exactly this scenario in his lucid moments before his breakdown. The treatment began immediately in the barn where Emma had once taught Thunder to trust human hands. As Dr. Foster administered the medications, Mason knelt beside Thunder's massive head, his small fingers tracing the white heart-shaped marking on the bull's forehead while maintaining his whispered conversation with both Thunder and his invisible companion. "Emma says her daddy wasn't really bad," Mason explained to the adults working frantically around him. "His brain got sick after she went to heaven, and the sickness made him think scary things that weren't true. But even when he was confused, he still loved Thunder enough to hide medicine where someone could find it. The transformation wasn't immediate, but within hours, Thunder's breathing became less labored. His temperature, which had spiked dangerously high, began dropping toward normal ranges. Most remarkably, his eyes regained some of their former alertness, focusing on Mason's face with recognition that had been absent for days. As the sun set over the abandoned ranch, painting the old barn in golden light that seemed to carry Emma's blessing, Thunder attempted to lift his head. The movement was weak but deliberate, his gaze seeking out Mason with an intensity that spoke of gratitude deeper than words could convey. "He's going to get better now," Mason announced with the certainty that had sustained him through months of disbelief. "Emma says thank you for helping her daddy's friend, and she's going back to heaven now because Thunder doesn't need her to stay anymore." Dr. Foster, monitoring Thunder's vital signs with equipment that hummed softly in the old barn, shook her head in professional amazement. "His kidney function is improving, liver enzymes are stabilizing, and his heart rate is returning to normal ranges. I've never seen such rapid improvement in a case this severe." But the day's revelations weren't finished. Detective Harrison's phone rang as they prepared to transport Thunder back to the Wheeler property. The caller ID showing the psychiatric facility in Austin where Bobby Hutchinson was receiving treatment. "Mr. Hutchinson experienced a breakthrough during his therapy session today," the facility's director explained. "His memories of hiding emergency supplies have returned, along with periods of clarity about his actions during his breakdown. He's been asking repeatedly whether Thunder survived, and whether the Wheeler family might consider allowing him to contribute to the bull's care costs. The conversation that followed revealed the true tragedy of Bobby Hutchinson's story. The man who had imprisoned Thunder in a desperate act of misguided love had been fighting his own demons, mental illness exacerbated by grief and financial stress, until reality became indistinguishable from paranoid fantasy. His lucid moments had produced the emergency medical supplies that were now saving Thunder's life, while his diseased thinking had nearly killed the animal he'd been trying to protect. "He wants to establish a trust fund for Thunder's care," the director continued. "Mr. Hutchinson has been working with our financial counselors to liquidate his remaining assets. It's part of his therapy, making amends for the harm his illness caused." Mason, overhearing the conversation, looked up from his position beside Thunder with the moral clarity that only children possess. "Tell the sad man that Thunder forgives him," he said simply. "And tell him that Emma forgives him too, because love doesn't stay mad when people's brains get sick." The journey back to the Wheeler property that evening felt like a resurrection parade. Thunder, stabilized on Bobby's hidden medications and responding to treatment with miraculous speed, rode in the trailer with his head lifted, watching the Texas countryside pass by with eyes that held hope instead of resignation. Mason sat beside him, both of them surrounded by medical equipment that beeped reassuringly instead of frantically. News of Thunder's turnaround spread through social media with the speed of answered prayers. The hashtag #HatThunderMiracle evolved from a story of impossible survival to one of healing and forgiveness, touching hearts across the country and inspiring donations for both Thunder's continued care and agricultural mental health initiatives. Mrs. Coleman, recovered from her heart episode and installed in a chair beside Thunder's recovery area, watched the bull attempt to stand for the first time since his rescue. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks. "In 75 years, I've never seen anything like this. That boy's faith moved mountains, and that bull's will to live defied every law of nature." Dr. Foster, updating her medical notes by lamplight in the Wheelers' garage, found herself documenting recovery rates that challenged everything she'd learned in veterinary school. "Thunder's response to treatment exceeds all medical expectations," she wrote. Whether attributing this to Bobby Hutchinson's precisely targeted medications, the bull's extraordinary constitution, or Mason Wheeler's unwavering emotional support, the outcome represents a remarkable example of survival against impossible odds. As midnight approached and Thunder's steady breathing filled the garage with the rhythm of healing, Mason curled up beside his friend with a peace that had been absent for days. "Thunder says Emma went back to heaven happy," he murmured sleepily. "And he says the sad man's heart is getting better too, just like Thunder's body is getting better." The miracle wasn't just Thunder's physical recovery. It was the revelation that love, even when twisted by illness and grief into something unrecognizable, could still plant the seeds of its own redemption. Bobby Hutchinson's lucid moments had prepared for this day, ensuring that his beloved Thunder would have a chance at the healing that mental illness had prevented Bobby from providing directly. Thunder, who had survived 18 months in darkness through sheer will and the promise of a 5-year-old's friendship, was finally truly safe. 6 months after Thunder's rescue, the Wheeler family's garage had been transformed into something resembling a small veterinary hospital, but the massive Brahman bull who occupied its center bore little resemblance to the skeletal creature they had pulled from Bobby Hutchinson's basement prison. Thunder's black and red coat now gleamed with health. His frame had filled out to nearly his original 800 pounds, and his eyes held the gentle intelligence that had sustained him through the darkest period of his life. Mason Wheeler, now 6 years old and possessing a wisdom that seemed to bypass his chronological age entirely, sat cross-legged beside Thunder's favorite resting spot, reading aloud from a picture book about farm animals. The bull listened with the patient attention of someone who had learned to cherish every moment of companionship after 18 months of solitude. Thunder likes the story about the cow who learned to jump over the moon, Mason explained to his mother as Sarah prepared Thunder's afternoon medication. He says it reminds him that impossible things can happen if you don't give up believing. The recovery had not been without challenges. Thunder's muscles, atrophied from prolonged confinement, had required months of physical therapy guided by Dr. Foster and executed with the determined patience of the Wheeler family. His trust in humans, damaged by Bobby's well-intentioned but devastating imprisonment, had needed careful rebuilding through consistent kindness and the unwavering loyalty of a small boy who had never stopped believing in their friendship. But the most remarkable aspect of Thunder's rehabilitation had been its effect on the surrounding community. What had begun as one family's act of faith had evolved into a movement that touched lives across Texas and beyond. The Bobby Hutchinson Agricultural Mental Health Foundation, established with funds from the liquidation of Bobby's remaining assets and donations inspired by Thunder's story, had already provided counseling and financial assistance to over 200 farming families struggling with depression, anxiety, and the devastating psychological effects of rural economic collapse. Mrs. Coleman, now 76, and Thunder's self-appointed grandmother, spent her afternoons in the Wheelers' backyard, sharing stories of the old days when ranchers knew every animal by name and communities rallied around neighbors in crisis without waiting for formal organizations to coordinate their response. "Back in my day," she would tell visitors who came to meet Thunder, "we understood that animals and children see straight to the heart of things. Maybe if we'd listened better to both, we wouldn't have let so many good people suffer in silence." The media attention that had initially felt intrusive had evolved into something more meaningful. Thunder's story had become a symbol of resilience and the power of unconditional love to overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. Children's books featured his journey from imprisonment to freedom. Agricultural publications used his case to highlight mental health resources for farming communities, and animal therapy programs across the country referenced his bond with Mason as evidence of the healing power of human-animal connections. Dr. Foster, whose veterinary practice had expanded to include a specialized program for rescuing livestock from neglect situations, often brought veterinary students to observe Thunder's continuing recovery. "This case challenges everything we thought we knew about survival limits," she would explain to the young professionals. Thunder's physical recovery defied medical expectations, but his emotional healing demonstrates the profound impact of consistent patient care combined with genuine affection. The most transformative development had been Bobby Hutchinson's gradual reintegration into Thunder's life. After 8 months of intensive psychiatric treatment, Bobby had been deemed stable enough for supervised visits to the Wheeler property. The first meeting between the man who had imprisoned Thunder and the bull who had suffered because of that imprisonment had been fraught with uncertainty and the potential for trauma on both sides. Mason, with the moral clarity that had guided him throughout Thunder's ordeal, had served as mediator between the two beings whose relationship had been twisted by mental illness into something unrecognizable. "Thunder knows the sad man's brain was sick," Mason had explained before Bobby's first visit. He says Emma told him that sometimes love gets confused when people hurt too much, but the love part is still real underneath the confusion. The reunion had been heartbreaking in its gentleness. Bobby, aged beyond his 58 years by guilt and psychiatric treatment, had approached Thunder with trembling hands and tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he had whispered, his voice breaking on words that carried 18 months of regret. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was the one causing the harm." Thunder's response had silenced the gathered observers and provided a lesson in forgiveness that transcended species barriers. The massive bull had approached Bobby slowly, carefully, and had gently nuzzled the man's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of understanding and absolution. The moment had been captured by a documentary film crew and had gone viral across social media platforms, inspiring discussions about mental health, forgiveness, and the capacity for healing even in the most damaged relationships. Bobby's recovery had paralleled Thunder's in many ways. Proper medication for his underlying bipolar disorder, combined with therapy to address his grief over Emma's death and Margaret's cancer, had restored much of his former personality. He had moved to a supervised living facility in Fredericksburg, where he worked part-time at the local feed store and spent his evenings writing letters to farming families who were struggling with mental health issues. "Thunder saved my life just as much as we saved his," Bobby had told a reporter during a recent interview. "Seeing him healthy and happy, knowing that the Wheeler family forgave my actions even when I couldn't forgive myself, gave me a reason to keep working on my recovery. That bull taught me that healing is possible, even when the damage seems too severe to repair." The Wheeler family had undergone their own transformation. Jake had started a consulting business focused on helping agricultural families navigate financial crises before they reached the breaking point that had destroyed Bobby's mental health. Sarah had returned to teaching, but now specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma, drawing on her experience with Mason's unwavering faith in the face of adult skepticism. Mason himself had become something of a local celebrity, but his parents had worked carefully to ensure that the attention didn't overshadow his normal childhood development. He attended first grade, played soccer, and enjoyed typical 6-year-old activities while maintaining his special relationship with Thunder and his apparent gift for understanding animal emotions. "Mason has a rare empathic ability," explained Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a child psychologist who had studied his case. "Whether you call it intuition, emotional intelligence, or something more mysterious, his capacity to connect with animals in distress represents a valuable skill that could benefit veterinary medicine and animal welfare programs." Thunder's physical presence in the Wheelers' backyard had necessitated significant property modifications. The family had expanded their land, built proper fencing, and created a barn that met all requirements for housing a bull of Thunder's size. But more importantly, they had created Thunder's Haven, a therapeutic program that brought children with emotional difficulties to interact with Thunder under professional supervision. The results had been remarkable. Children who had been traumatized by family divorces, medical procedures, or other life disruptions found comfort in Thunder's patient presence and his story of survival against impossible odds. Mason often served as a bridge between the visiting children and Thunder, translating the bull's gentle responses and helping young visitors understand that healing was possible even after terrible experiences. "Thunder remembers being scared and alone," Mason would tell children who came to visit. "But he also remembers that help came when he thought nobody cared anymore. He wants you to know that being scared doesn't mean you're not brave, and feeling sad doesn't mean you won't feel happy again." Dr. Foster had documented several cases where children who hadn't spoken since traumatic events had begun communicating after spending time with Thunder. The bull's own journey from imprisonment to freedom seemed to resonate with young minds in ways that traditional therapy sometimes couldn't reach. The program had attracted attention from universities studying animal-assisted therapy, leading to research partnerships that provided both funding for Thunder's care and valuable data about the healing potential of human-animal bonds. Mason participated in age-appropriate research activities, helping scientists understand how children's natural empathy toward animals could be channeled into therapeutic interventions. As autumn arrived in the Texas Hill Country, painting the landscape in colors that Emma Hutchinson would have loved, Thunder's story reached a milestone that few observers had anticipated during those dark days when his survival seemed impossible. A major children's book publisher had commissioned a series based on Thunder's journey, with proceeds supporting agricultural mental health programs and animal rescue initiatives. The Wheeler family gathered in their backyard on a crisp October evening, watching Thunder graze peacefully in grass that had grown green and thick under the Texas sun. Bobby Hutchinson sat nearby, his presence no longer causing Thunder distress, but instead seeming to complete some essential circle of healing and forgiveness. Mrs. Coleman, now settled in a comfortable chair with a blanket across her knees, watched the scene with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed the impossible become possible through the persistence of a child's faith and the resilience of love in all its forms. "Look at that," she said softly, pointing to where Mason had fallen asleep against Thunder's side while reading his homework aloud. A boy and his bull, both of them safe and sound after everything they've been through. "Sometimes I think Emma's still here, making sure her two favorite beings take care of each other." Thunder's gentle rumble of contentment carried across the evening air, a sound that spoke of peace found after long suffering, of trust rebuilt after devastating betrayal, and of love's power to transform even the most broken circumstances into something beautiful and healing. The miracle wasn't just that Thunder had survived 18 months in a concrete prison, or that Mason's faith had remained unshaken when every adult around him expressed doubt. The true miracle was that their story had touched thousands of lives, inspiring families to seek help before crisis points, encouraging communities to support their struggling neighbors, and demonstrating that healing was possible even in situations that seemed beyond redemption. As stars appeared over the Texas hill country, Thunder's breathing settled into the peaceful rhythm of an animal who had found his forever home, while Mason slept safely beside his friend, both of them surrounded by the love that had sustained them through their darkest hours and would continue to protect them through all the bright tomorrows that lay ahead. For those of us who've lived long enough to witness both heartbreak and miracles, Thunder's story reminds us of a profound truth we sometimes forget in our golden years. The purest wisdom often comes from the smallest voices, and the greatest acts of faith happen when everyone else has given up hope. Like many of you reading this, I've watched neighbors struggle through agricultural crises, seen good families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, and wondered if the values we raised our children with, persistence, compassion, unwavering belief in doing what's right, still matter in today's world. Mason Wheeler's refusal to stop believing in Thunder, even when every adult dismissed his claims, speaks to the kind of stubborn faith that built this country. Mrs. Coleman's decision to trust a child's intuition over conventional wisdom reflects the community spirit that once defined rural America. Bobby Hutchinson's journey from mental breakdown to redemption shows us that it's never too late for second chances, healing, and forgiveness. In an era when too many of our generation feel forgotten or irrelevant, Thunder's story proves that miracles still happen when we choose to listen with our hearts instead of our doubts, and when we remember that love, patient, persistent, unconditional love, can overcome any obstacle, even death itself. What childhood memory of trusting your instincts against adult doubt do you carry with you? Have you ever witnessed an animal's loyalty that reminded you of the purest form of love? Share your story below. Our community needs to hear these reminders that faith and love still triumph.